Debra Morgan is the series' most reliable special effect, a human being written to absorb every consequence the narrative prefers not to pin on its charmingly narrated killer. The result is an audience split between grief and irritation, admiration and exasperation, as though emotional investment were an optional subscription tier. On one side sits the argument that Debra is among television's most tragic figures, authentic, intelligent, driven, and relentlessly punished for loving the wrong person with the wrong secrets. She starts as the younger sibling still auditioning for legitimacy, at home, in the station, in her own head, then spends the series clawing upward through a workplace that treats bravado as a job qualification and composure as a substitute for processing trauma. She rises in rank, tries to build relationships, attempts to hold herself together, and is rewarded with a conveyor belt of loss and humiliation that would be excessive if it were not so clearly intentional. The defining cruelty is that her suffering is not merely incidental to the weekly villains. It is structurally tied to Dexter Morgan. Debra is not simply harmed by criminals. She is harmed by proximity to the show's moral black hole, the brother who narrates his own monstrosity with the calm confidence of a man certain the audience will forgive him for being interesting. Dexter's relationship with Debra is frequently framed as protective, but protection built on lies is just a slower form of injury, and the series commits to that injury with remarkable consistency. Manipulation, strategic omissions, selective truth-telling, reassurance designed to keep her compliant, and the emotional distortion that makes her question her instincts while still believing she is choosing freely. In any other context, the dynamic would be labeled abusive without hesitation, yet the narrative keeps one foot on the brake, as if acknowledging the harm too plainly might interrupt the protagonist's charm offensive. Debra's tragedy is sharpened by the specific kind of denial she is written to perform. The relationship functions not because Dexter is safe, but because Debra needs him to be. She clings to the fantasy of the protective older brother as though it were a life preserver, and the show treats that pedestal as a structural support for her psyche. The more evidence accumulates that Dexter is the opposite of what she needs him to be, the more she bargains with reality, minimizing, rationalizing, cutting slack, compromising boundaries, because confronting the full truth would collapse the story she relies on to survive. The reveal of Dexter's true nature is therefore less a plot twist than a psychological demolition. Debra is asked to reconcile the brother she worships with the monster he is, and the series turns that reconciliation into a slow corrosion of identity. Confidence erodes, judgment warps. The instinct to do her job is increasingly forced into conflict with the instinct to keep her family intact, and the show makes that internal war look like character development while quietly staging a breakdown. When therapy appears, PTSD acknowledged rather than merely dramatized, it is briefly tempting to imagine the series will allow recovery to mean something. A shred of hope is offered. Debra reaches for treatment, reorients toward work, attempts to rebuild a self that is not merely Dexter's accomplice by relationship. Then the series does what it does best. It takes the hope, examines it for symbolic usefulness, and discards it when it becomes inconvenient. The final insult is the manner of Debra's exit. After years of being written as the person who compromises, covers, forgives, and bleeds for Dexter's secrets, she dies while still viewing him through the sentimental lens that harmed her, the good brother, the anchor, the safe place. The future that recovery teased is not simply denied, it is snatched away for effect. The narrative chooses to make her another victim of Dexter's wake, and leans on the poetry of disposal, water, ritual, the same visual language used for his other victims, as though symbolism could replace basic dignity. If tragedy is defined by a character's devotion being used against her, Debra qualifies with brutal efficiency. Of course, the counter-argument arrives on schedule. Debra is unbearable. The indictment is familiar and, at times, not entirely unsupported by the early writing. She can be needy, volatile, and intensely convinced that every interpersonal inconvenience is a referendum on her worth. She blames Dexter for problems that are not always his doing, spirals loudly, and broadcasts insecurity with the kind of volume that can make a viewer feel trapped in a room with someone else's unresolved childhood. Early seasons in particular lean into an incompetent baby sister register, whiny, desperate, socially frantic, as if the writers assumed the fastest way to signal younger sibling was to remove a layer of adult dignity. The irony is that even among detractors, a strange thing happens. A scene lands, and the narrative changes shape. The grief scene in the parking lot after Lundy is shot is frequently treated as the turning point, not because Debra suddenly becomes less annoying, but because the performance forces recognition. The portrayal is not neat, photogenic, or built for tidy catharsis. It is panicked and physically uncontrolled in a way television often avoids. Standard screen grief tends to be curated. A few tears, a controlled voice, a brief tremble, then the plot returns. Here, grief looks like the body refusing to cooperate, and that discomfort reads as truth. This is where Jennifer Carpenter's work becomes the inconvenient fact in every debate. It is easy to call Debra annoying. It is harder to deny that the actress playing her is formidable. Even criticism often collapses into reluctant admiration. The character grates because the performance is specific enough to be real. Carpenter sells chaos with precision, body language that reads as lived in, anger that does not require glamour to be compelling, vulnerability that arrives with velocity rather than theatrical pacing, and the refusal to make Debra likable on cue becomes part of the character's credibility. The familiar accusation that Debra is overly emotional is also a selective memory problem. Early Debra is not introduced as a perpetual open wound. She is described as someone not prone to wearing emotions on her sleeve. The shift toward outward intensity is not random. It is the cumulative consequence of the trauma the narrative keeps stacking on her. Next to Dexter, whose affect is flattened by design, any human response looks excessive. The series rigs the comparison. Place an emotionally muted protagonist beside a character forced to react like a person, then scold the person for being too alive. Where the writing becomes indefensible is in its more sensational choices, none more notorious than the decision to frame Debra's feelings for Dexter as romantic. Sibling love would have sufficed. The series already had an entire architecture built on codependency, loyalty, and the consequences of Harry Morgan's parenting. Turning that relationship into something quasi-incestuous is not bold. It is lazy provocation dressed up as psychological daring, and it functions less as insight than as a desperate attempt to generate shock when more organic tension had already been earned. That choice sits alongside other decisions widely viewed as symptomatic of a decline, including the sense that the show's quality nosedives after Rita is killed. Killing Rita can be defended as escalation, but it also reads as a strategic mistake. It eliminates the possibility of the most narratively honest confrontation the series kept postponing, the moment Rita learns who Dexter truly is, replacing complexity with abrupt tragedy and then expecting the audience to call it art. The frustration extends beyond Debra to the broader ensemble, which is regularly criticized as underdeveloped. Angel Batista and Vince Masuka have moments. Masuka is allowed genuine competence during the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, creating the delicious irony of Dexter nearly being caught by a colleague often treated as comic relief. But much of Miami Metro operates as set dressing. Joey Quinn is perpetually adjacent to significance without fully entering it. Maria LaGuerta is the most glaring example of wasted potential. She is positioned to be formidable, yet is often reduced to suspicious boss, with the show oddly unwilling to fully explore why she targets Debra, why her professional hostility veers into personal territory, or why certain career and romantic choices land as sketchy shortcuts rather than layered ambition. Some of her best material appears only shortly before she is removed, when she reopens the Bay Harbor butcher thread and forces institutional resistance into the open. And even then, the series can't resist turning her into another stepping stone in Dexter's moral escape act. Then there are the could-have-been storylines that linger like unfinished renovations. Brian Moser being Dexter's brother arrives early, and many argue the reveal would have hit harder later, perhaps as an endgame confrontation rather than a first-season crescendo. The practical explanation is clear. Early seasons are built under renewal uncertainty, so major arcs are deployed before they can be lost. Still, the early detonation leaves later seasons scrambling for threats with comparable weight. Other fan-preferred adjustments are similarly blunt. Isaac Serco deserved more runway. Certain side antagonists should have returned. Even the throwaway wish for Chicky Hines to appear again reflects a broader complaint that the show introduces colorful material only to move on before it can ripen. Debra herself becomes a magnet for these rewrite impulses, because her arc is both central and repeatedly mishandled. The performer's visibility after the series even becomes a talking point, as though the industry is another case Miami Metro failed to close. After a role that required rage, panic, grief, shame, swagger, and vulnerability, often in the same episode, the expectation might be constant prestige casting. Instead, the public career footprint appears comparatively modest, whether by personal choice, industry myopia, or the familiar phenomenon of an actor being too strongly associated with a singular role. On paper, the answers are pedestrian. Dexter begins as an established specialist. Debra begins as a lower-ranked officer still proving herself, paying rent and living expenses earlier without the same runway. Later promotions can justify later lifestyle upgrades, including nicer cars such as the later BMW convertible and better housing. The supposedly implausible beachfront apartment even appears in real listings on Zillow at prices that are not fantasy. These explanations are tidy, and that is exactly why they fail to satisfy once the audience remembers the beachfront view, the boat, the extra property, and the protagonist's capacity for impulsive purchases. Dexter's frugality is credited with near monastic discipline, as though a man with elaborate nightly rituals lacks a taste for indulgence. Debra's shortfall is blamed on being social, as though adulthood is a budgeting error. The more honest explanation is simpler. This is television, and television likes tidy contrasts and scenic rentals more than it likes consistent math. The supply question pushes that realism gap into comedy. Plastic sheeting, tools, transportation, and disposal materials are not cheap, and buying in bulk is not the airtight solution it sounds like. Records create trails create risk, and a man who survives on secrecy does not need a paper trail with a receipt number. A more plausible theory is also the most uncomfortable one. Cash extracted from victims becomes cash spent on untraceable necessities. It is the kind of practical detail the series prefers not to dramatize, because it would require acknowledging the protagonist as something other than a neatly managed anti-hero with a hobby. Rewatching also changes the verdict. Weekly airing and long gaps encourage selective memory. Big twists survive, the connective tissue dissolves, and Debra's volatility is remembered without the context that produced it. Streaming compresses the experience and exposes patterns, the forced intensity, the repetitive conflicts, the way trauma is used as fuel rather than treated as aftermath. Later material complicates the legacy further. New Blood offers a more grounded Debra, while the loudest, fresh irritation is often aimed at newer reinterpretations, including Original Sin's version of the character. The hallucination version, in particular, is coherent in concept and punishing in effect. Debra is reduced to Dexter's conscience, a projection that can be written to scold without granting independent aims, which conveniently preserves her usefulness while stripping her agency. Some viewers appreciate the reminder of what the story lost. Others only hear the amplification of every trait once labeled annoying, now untethered from the humanity that once justified it. These debates reveal an asymmetry that shadows the character. Debra is examined as though her choices must be rational, calibrated, and admirable. Dexter's impossibilities are granted the courtesy of fiction. Debra's emotional transparency is treated as a personal flaw. Dexter's emotional vacancy is treated as mystique. The verdict becomes predictable. The character who behaves most like a person is scolded for being insufficiently convenient. The book comparisons add another layer of dissatisfaction. The novels diverge sharply even early on, with altered outcomes and characterizations that make direct comparison an exercise in managing expectations. La Guerta, for instance, is dispatched early in the books, and is more openly hostile and suspicious without the show's slow burn tension. Dexter is described as far less normalized than his television counterpart, less emotionally accessible, more purely psychopathic, making him harder to like and therefore harder to excuse. Debra in print is also often treated as less competent, reduced to cursing and pleading for Dexter's help, which only highlights what the television version accomplishes when it allows her to be sharp, capable, and credible. Even within the televised canon, growth complicates the annoying label. Many criticisms cluster in the first season, when Debra is written with an almost comedic desperation. As the seasons progress, the character is often seen as improving, less whiny, more rooted, more competent, because the show finally allows her to function as an equal rather than an accessory. The guilt arc following La Guerta's death is a case study in what the show does well when it tries. Debra's collapse, the betrayal, self-hatred, and disorientation lands because the performance refuses neatness. The conversations with Dexter in the immediate aftermath are among the few times the series lets consequences feel lived in rather than episodic, and Carpenter's work sells the idea that guilt is not a scene, but a condition. The question of why Debra provokes such extreme reactions is ultimately a question about what audiences demand from female characters in prestige-leaning drama. Debra is reckless and aggressive, but also tender, insecure, and emotionally transparent. In lesser hands, those traits would become caricature. Here, they become divisive because they are recognizable. She embodies insecurities that are easy to ridicule from a distance and uncomfortable to confront up close, and the show alternates between using those insecurities as punchlines and using them as tragedy, depending on the week's needs. That dynamic is also what makes the codependency reading persuasive. Harry Morgan's parenting creates a lopsided family system. Dexter receives intense attention and training. Debra is left to chase scraps of approval. The siblings grow up needing each other to survive. Debra needing the brother she believes will protect her. Dexter needing the sister whose love allows him to pretend he is something other than what he is. Early seasons conceal Dexter's dependence behind competence and detachment, but later seasons make it harder to deny. He is as reliant on Debra as she is on him, just more practiced at disguising reliance as preference. When the series briefly lets Debra be the clearest moral compass in the room, it works. When it punishes her for that clarity by forcing compromise after compromise, it reveals its own priorities. Debra's blunt confrontation with Lila about Dexter's lies is a rare comic relief. In the end, the series can keep its clever plot twists and its theatrically satisfying kills. The sharper twist is that the most heartbreaking character is not the man who narrates the story, But the woman the story repeatedly asks to clean up after him, forgive him, save him, and finally disappear for him. Calling her annoying is sometimes an honest reaction to clumsy writing. Calling her tragic is sometimes an honest reaction to what the writing actually accomplishes. The uncomfortable truth is that both are accurate, and the series relies on that accuracy. Debra endures. The ledger remains. Study.